The October air in Millbrook, Indiana, carried the crisp promise of winter, and the maple trees lining Main Street had turned brilliant shades of amber and crimson. It was Halloween night, 1986, and the small town buzzed with the excitement that only came once a year. Children in elaborate costumes gathered along the sidewalks, their parents adjusting masks and straightening capes as the annual Halloween parade prepared to begin. Among the crowd, three inseparable friends stood together near the starting line. 11-year-old Rebecca Martinez, dressed as a vampire with a flowing black cape. Tommy Chen, sporting a magician's outfit complete with a matching cape. And David Robertson, who had chosen to be a superhero, his red cape billowing in the evening breeze. If you're enjoying this mysterious tale, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers around the world. Now, let's continue with what would become one of Indiana's most enduring mysteries. The trio had been best friends since kindergarten, practically inseparable since they'd first bonded over their shared love of comic books and mystery novels. Rebecca, the natural leader of the group, was known for her infectious laugh and fierce loyalty to her friends. Tommy, quiet but brilliant, could solve any puzzle put before him and had a habit of carrying a small notebook where he jotted down observations about everything around him. David, the most athletic of the three, was always ready with a joke to lighten any mood, though those who knew him well could see the sensitivity beneath his cheerful exterior. The Halloween parade was Millbrook's biggest event, drawing families from neighboring towns to watch as children marched down Main Street, their costumes judged by local business owners and community leaders. The route was simple. Starting at the elementary school, proceeding down Main Street past the courthouse, and ending at the town park where hot cider and donuts waited. Police officers directed traffic, and volunteers stationed themselves along the route to ensure everyone's safety. As the parade began, Rebecca, Tommy, and David fell into step with the other children. Mrs. Henderson, Rebecca's sixth-grade teacher, had seen them at the starting line, noting how excited they seemed about the evening ahead. The trio stayed together as they walked, their matching capes, all purchased from the same costume shop at the Millbrook Mall, catching the light from the street lamps. Several adults along the parade route later recalled seeing the three friends laughing and pointing at decorations in store windows as they passed. The parade proceeded normally for the first half of the route. Parents took photographs, store owners handed out candy, and the children waved enthusiastically at the crowd. But somewhere between the courthouse and the park, in a stretch of Main Street that passed by the old Millbrook Theater, which had been abandoned since 1982, something went wrong. When the parade reached its destination at the town park, Rebecca Martinez, Tommy Chen, and David Robertson were no longer among the marchers. At first, their absence wasn't immediately noticed. With over 200 children participating and the excitement of the evening's festivities, it took nearly 30 minutes before parents began looking for their missing children. Rebecca's mother, Maria Martinez, had been waiting at the park with other parents, expecting to see her daughter emerge from the crowd of costumed children. When she didn't appear, Maria initially assumed Rebecca had gotten distracted or had stopped to talk with friends. Tommy's parents, Dr. James and Linda Chen, had been taking photographs along the route and had driven ahead to the park to capture their son's arrival. They too began to worry when Tommy failed to appear among the dispersing crowd. David's father, Robert Robertson, a mechanic who worked long hours but never missed important events in his son's life, had left work early specifically to see David in the parade. When his boy didn't show up at the designated meeting spot near the bandstand, a cold fear began to settle in his stomach. By 8:30 that evening, with the official parade activities winding down, the three sets of parents had found each other and confirmed their worst fears. All three children were missing. They retraced the parade route on foot, calling out names and asking other families if they'd seen Rebecca, Tommy, or David. Several people remembered seeing the three friends early in the parade, but no one could recall spotting them during the latter portion of the route. The Millbrook Police Department, led by Chief William Anders, was notified at 9:15 p.m. Chief Anders, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement who had never dealt with missing children in his quiet town, immediately organized a search effort. Officers began canvassing the parade route, interviewing witnesses and checking every alley, doorway, and potential hiding spot along Main Street. The fire department was called in to assist, and within an hour, nearly 50 volunteers had joined the search. As the night wore on, the search expanded beyond the immediate parade route. Teams of volunteers, armed with flashlights, combed through the residential neighborhoods surrounding downtown, checking backyards, abandoned buildings, and anywhere three children might have wandered or gotten lost. The old theater, with its boarded-up windows and overgrown landscaping, received particular attention from searchers, but revealed no signs of the missing children. Dr. Chen, drawing on his methodical nature as a family physician, organized a timeline of sightings. The last confirmed visual contact with the three friends had been at approximately 7:45 p.m., when Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, who owned the flower shop on Main Street, remembered waving at them as they passed her storefront. She specifically recalled Rebecca's vampire cape and how all three children had waved back enthusiastically. After that point, despite the dozens of people lining the parade route, no one could definitively place the trio anywhere along the remaining path to the park. State police were contacted before midnight, and by dawn on November 1st, the search had expanded to include K-9 units from neighboring counties. The dogs picked up scent trails that led from the last known sighting point toward the old theater district, but the trails went cold in the parking lot behind the abandoned Millbrook Theater. FBI agents arrived by the afternoon, treating the case as a potential kidnapping given the complete disappearance of three children simultaneously. The investigation revealed no signs of struggle, no witnesses to any confrontation or unusual activity, and no ransom demands. Interviews with every adult who had been present at the parade yielded a frustrating collection of partial memories and conflicting accounts. Some witnesses thought they remembered seeing the children near the courthouse at 8 o'clock, while others were certain they'd spotted them heading in the opposite direction around the same time. The confusion was compounded by the fact that dozens of other children had been wearing similar costumes. Several other vampires, magicians, and superheroes had participated in the parade, making positive identification difficult in the darkness. As days turned into weeks, the story of the missing Millbrook children gained national attention. News crews descended on the small town, setting up outside the police station and interviewing anyone willing to talk. The families of the missing children appeared on morning talk shows and evening news programs, pleading for information about their children's whereabouts. Photographs of Rebecca, Tommy, and David, both individual school portraits and a group photo taken just days before Halloween, were distributed nationwide and featured on milk cartons and missing children posters. The FBI's investigation uncovered no evidence of the children having been taken by strangers. Background checks on every adult who had been present at the parade revealed no red flags or suspicious histories. The children's personal lives were scrutinized, their friendships, their activities, their families' circumstances. All three came from stable, loving homes with no history of abuse or family conflict that might have prompted them to run away. Rebecca had been excited about an upcoming school play. Tommy had been looking forward to a science fair project on astronomy. David had plans to try out for the school basketball team after the holiday break. Theories abounded in the community and in the media. Some suggested the children had wandered off and gotten lost in the rural areas surrounding Millbrook. though extensive searches of farms, wooded areas, and creek beds yielded nothing. Others proposed they had been abducted by strangers passing through town on Halloween night, taking advantage of the chaos and confusion of the parade to snatch 3 victims unnoticed. A few investigators wondered if the children had witnessed something they shouldn't have, perhaps criminal activity, and had been silenced as a result. The town of Millbrook was forever changed by the disappearance. Parents became more protective. Children were rarely allowed out unsupervised, and the annual Halloween parade was cancelled indefinitely. The sense of innocence and security that had defined the small community was shattered. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, wondering if someone they knew and trusted might be harboring terrible secrets. The old Millbrook Theater, already a symbol of the town's declining fortunes, became a focus of local folklore and fear, with many residents convinced it held answers to the mystery. Years passed without resolution. The case files grew thick with reports, interviews, and false leads. Psychics offered their services, claiming to have visions of the children's fate. Amateur investigators arrived periodically, convinced they could solve the mystery that had stumped professionals. The families never gave up hope, though the constant disappointment of failed leads and dead ends took its toll on their marriages, their health, and their ability to move forward with their lives. Maria Martinez divorced her husband 2 years after Rebecca's disappearance, unable to bear his increasing obsession with conspiracy theories about the case. Dr. Chen took a leave of absence from his medical practice and spent months driving through neighboring states, following up on every reported sighting of children who might have been Tommy. Robert Robertson quit his job and dedicated himself full-time to searching for David, eventually exhausting his savings and losing his home. The trauma rippled through extended families and the broader community, leaving invisible scars that would never fully heal. By 1995, nearly a decade after the disappearance, the case had grown cold, despite periodic efforts to re-examine the evidence with new technologies and investigative techniques. The original investigators had retired or moved on to other assignments, and while the case remained officially open, active investigation had essentially ceased. The families continued to mark birthdays and holidays for their missing children, aging photographs displayed prominently in their homes as shrines to lives interrupted. The old Millbrook Theater, meanwhile, had deteriorated further with each passing year. The building's owners had died, and their heirs showed no interest in maintaining or developing the property. The structure became a magnet for vandals and urban explorers, despite periodic efforts by local authorities to secure it. Broken windows were boarded up, graffiti covered the exterior walls, and weeds grew tall around the foundation. For many residents, the building served as a physical reminder of the town's darkest hour. In 2010, 24 years after the disappearance, the case received renewed attention when a documentary filmmaker arrived in Millbrook to investigate cold cases in small-town America. The resulting film, 3 Lost Souls, brought national media attention back to the story and prompted several new tips to law enforcement. However, these leads, like all the others over the years, ultimately led nowhere. The filmmaker's most significant contribution was organizing the first comprehensive review of the case file in over a decade. But even this fresh perspective failed to uncover any overlooked clues or evidence. The surviving family members had aged significantly by this point. Maria Martinez, now in her 60s, had remarried and moved to Arizona, though she returned to Millbrook every Halloween to leave flowers at the spot where her daughter was last seen. Dr. Chen had eventually returned to medicine, but had never fully recovered from the loss of his son, becoming increasingly reclusive as the years passed. Robert Robertson had developed serious health problems, partly attributed to the stress and lifestyle changes following David's disappearance. Yet all 3 parents maintained that they would never give up hope of learning what had happened to their children. The town itself had evolved too. Millbrook's downtown had continued to decline as shopping moved to larger nearby cities, and many of the businesses that had been present during the 1986 Halloween parade had closed or relocated. The old courthouse where the children had last been definitively seen had been renovated and converted into a community center. New families had moved to town with no direct connection to the tragedy, while others who had lived through it preferred not to discuss those dark days. For many residents, the missing children had become almost mythical figures, their story passed down like a cautionary tale rather than a lived memory. Technology had advanced dramatically since 1986, and cold case investigators periodically revisited the evidence using new forensic techniques. DNA analysis, which had been in its infancy during the original investigation, was applied to any physical evidence that had been preserved from the scene. Digital age progression software was used to create images of what Rebecca, Tommy, and David might look like as adults. Social media campaigns were launched to spread awareness of the case to new generations who might have information about the disappearance. Yet despite these modern tools and approaches, the mystery remained as impenetrable as ever. As 2023 approached, marking 37 years since that fateful Halloween night, the case seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. The original investigators had long since retired or passed away, taking with them any insights or theories that might never have been formally documented. The children, if they had survived, would now be adults in their late 40s, possibly with children of their own. The possibility that they might return home voluntarily seemed increasingly remote, leading many to conclude that the three friends had met with foul play on that October evening in 1986. It was against this backdrop of resignation and faded hope that construction workers arrived at the old Millbrook Theater site in early September 2023. The property had finally been sold to a development company planning to demolish the deteriorating structure and build a small shopping complex. The demolition crew, contracted by Hartwell Construction out of Indianapolis, began the process of clearing debris and preparing the site for teardown. The theater's basement, which had been flooded repeatedly over the years due to failing infrastructure, required pumping and cleaning before demolition could proceed safely. It was during this preliminary work that crew foreman Jake Martinez, no relation to the missing girl despite sharing a surname, made a discovery that would resurrect one of Indiana's most famous cold cases. Working in the basement's southeast corner, Martinez was using a shop vac to clear accumulated debris and standing water when the machine's suction pulled something unusual from beneath a collapsed section of ceiling tiles and rotted wooden beams. At first glance, it appeared to be fabric, black material that had been preserved by the basement's consistently cool and damp conditions. As Martinez carefully extracted the item, he realized he was looking at a child's cape, the kind worn as part of a Halloween costume. His first instinct was to assume it was simply debris from decades of the building being used by local teenagers as a hangout spot. But as he examined the cape more closely, Martinez noticed its distinctive construction and the small tag sewn into the collar, a tag that identified it as having been manufactured by Costume Palace, a company that had gone out of business in the early 1990s. More significantly, the cape appeared to be sized for a child, and despite its time in the basement, it remained largely intact. Martinez immediately notified his supervisor, who made the decision to contact local authorities before proceeding with any further work in that area of the basement. Within an hour, Detective Patricia Reeves of the Millbrook Police Department, one of only 2 full-time investigators in the small department, arrived at the scene. Detective Reeves, who was 42 years old and had grown up in a neighboring town, was familiar with the case of the missing children, though she had been only 5 years old when they disappeared. Working methodically, Detective Reeves began a careful examination of the area where the cape had been found. Using a metal detector borrowed from the county sheriff's department, she and the construction crew began searching the basement more systematically. Within 2 hours, they had located 2 additional items: another child's cape, this one dark blue, and a red cape that had been partially buried under decades of debris. The discovery sent shockwaves through Millbrook and the broader region. News of the find spread quickly through social media and local news outlets, and by evening, reporters from major networks were en route to the small Indiana town. The 3 capes were immediately sent to the Indiana State Police Forensic Laboratory for analysis, though preliminary examination suggested they matched descriptions of the costumes worn by Rebecca Martinez, Tommy Chen, and David Robertson on the night they vanished. Dr. James Chen, now 78 years old and living in a retirement community in Florida, received the call from Detective Reeves on a Tuesday afternoon. Despite his age and the decades that had passed, his memory of that Halloween night remained crystal clear. When shown photographs of the blue cape that had been recovered, he immediately identified distinctive stitching along the hem, repairs that his wife Linda had made when Tommy caught the cape on a fence post during a practice wearing of his costume the week before Halloween. "That's Tommy's cape," he said without hesitation, his voice breaking with emotion. "Linda sewed that patch herself. I remember her doing it at the kitchen table." Maria Martinez, reached at her home in Phoenix, was equally certain that the black vampire cape belonged to her daughter. She remembered purchasing it specifically at Costume Palace in the Millbrook Mall, and could identify the way Rebecca had personalized it by adding small silver buttons to the collar. "Becca thought those buttons made her look more mysterious," Maria recalled through tears during a phone interview with investigators. "She was so proud of that cape. She wore it around the house for a week before Halloween, practicing her vampire walk." Robert Robertson, now living in a nursing facility in Fort Wayne and suffering from early-stage dementia, was shown photographs of the red cape by social workers and his daughter, who had driven in from Michigan upon hearing the news. Despite his cognitive limitations, Robertson's face lit up with recognition when he saw the image. "That's my boy's cape," he whispered, reaching out to touch the photograph. "David wanted to be a superhero, said he was going to save the world." His daughter later confirmed that her father had kept detailed records and photographs of David's costume, and the red cape matched perfectly. The discovery of the capes raised as many questions as it answered. How had the children's costumes ended up in the basement of the abandoned theater? Had the children been in the building on Halloween night, or had someone else placed the capes there? Most importantly, what had happened to Rebecca, Tommy, and David themselves? The basement revealed no other evidence, no bones, no additional clothing, no personal items that might have belonged to the missing children. Forensic analysis of the capes provided some additional information, but no definitive answers. The fabric had been preserved remarkably well due to the basement's cool, damp conditions, though there were signs of deterioration consistent with nearly 4 decades of exposure to moisture and fluctuating temperatures. More significantly, testing revealed the presence of human DNA on all 3 capes, though the samples were degraded and the analysis would take weeks to complete. Detective Reeves reopened the investigation with a sense of urgency she hadn't felt since beginning her law enforcement career 15 years earlier. She spent days reviewing the original case files, interviewing anyone still alive who had been present at the 1986 Halloween parade, and trying to piece together how the costumes had ended up in the theater basement. The building's history became a crucial focus of the renewed investigation. Records showed that the Millbrook Theater had been closed to the public since 1982, when declining attendance and competition from multiplex cinemas in larger nearby towns had forced its closure. However, the building hadn't been completely abandoned immediately. For several years after its closing, the owners had used it for storage, and various community groups had occasionally rented it for private events. Local teenagers had also discovered ways to enter the building, using it as an unofficial hangout spot, despite periodic efforts by police to secure the premises. In 1986, the year of the disappearance, the theatre was owned by Harold and Margaret Winters, an elderly couple who lived in a farmhouse several miles outside of town. Harold Winters had died in 1994, and Margaret had passed away in 2001, both taking any knowledge they might have had about the building's condition or use during that period to their graves. Their children, now in their 60s and living in other states, had only vague memories of their parents' involvement with the theatre property. Detective Reeves tracked down several individuals who, as teenagers in 1986, had admitted to entering the abandoned theatre illegally. Now middle-aged adults with careers and families of their own, most were initially reluctant to discuss their youthful indiscretions. However, the gravity of the cold case and the discovery of the capes eventually prompted several to share their memories. Gary Watson, now a high school principal in a neighboring town, had been 16 in 1986 and admitted to frequently entering the theatre with friends during that period. He recalled that access was usually gained through a basement window on the building's north side, where a loose board could be moved aside to create an opening large enough for teenagers to squeeze through. Watson and his friends had used the theatre's main auditorium for parties and gatherings, but he insisted they had never ventured much into the basement due to flooding and structural concerns. More intriguingly, Watson remembered that on Halloween night 1986, he and several friends had planned to meet at the theatre after the parade for what they called a Halloween party. Essentially, an unsupervised gathering where they could drink beer stolen from parents' refrigerators and engage in typical teenage mischief. However, Watson claimed that when they arrived at the theatre around 9:30 that evening, they found the basement entrance had been secured more thoroughly than usual, with boards nailed firmly in place and no easy way to gain access. "We were really frustrated," Watson recalled during his interview with Detective Reeves. "We'd been looking forward to that party all week and suddenly we couldn't get in. Someone had obviously been there earlier and really sealed the place up tight. We ended up going to Jimmy Patterson's house instead because his parents were out of town." Watson's account was corroborated by two of his former friends, now living in other parts of Indiana, who remembered the disappointment of their failed Halloween party plans. This new information suggested that someone had been at the theatre on Halloween night 1986, either before or during the time period when the three children went missing. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. The same evening that Rebecca, Tommy, and David vanished, unknown individuals had taken measures to secure the building that had been easily accessible to local teenagers for months. Detective Reeves began to develop a theory that the missing children might have encountered someone at the theatre, leading to a confrontation or situation that resulted in their disappearance. Further investigation revealed additional pieces of the puzzle. Emma Kowalski, now a retired librarian living in a senior community near Indianapolis, had been working as a waitress at Murphy's Diner on Main Street in 1986. The restaurant was located directly across from the old theatre, and Kowalski had been working the evening shift on Halloween night. When contacted by Detective Reeves, she initially claimed to have no specific memories of that evening, but after several days of reflection, she called back with information that sent chills down the detective's spine. "I've been thinking about that night ever since you called," Kowalski explained during a second interview, "and I do remember something strange. It was probably around 8 or 8:15. The parade was still going on. I could hear the music and see all the people through the diner windows. But I noticed there were lights on in the theatre, which was weird because that place had been dark for years. Not bright lights, more like flashlights or lanterns moving around inside. I remember thinking it was probably kids sneaking in there again." Kowalski's revelation provided the first concrete evidence that someone had been inside the theater on Halloween night during the critical time period when the children disappeared. Combined with the teenager's account of finding the basement entrance secured later that evening, a picture began to emerge of deliberate activity at the building during the hours surrounding the vanishing. Detective Reeves expanded her investigation to examine any other unusual activity that might have occurred in Millbrook on Halloween night, 1986. She reviewed police reports from that period, looking for any incidents that might have been connected to the children's disappearance. Most of the calls that evening had been routine: noise complaints about parties, reports of minor vandalism, and a few domestic disputes that had escalated due to holiday drinking. However, one incident report caught her attention. At approximately 10:15 p.m. on Halloween night, police had responded to a report of suspicious activity at the old railroad yard on the outskirts of town. A resident living nearby had called to report seeing vehicle lights and hearing what sounded like digging or construction work in an area that should have been deserted. When Officer Dennis Murphy, who had since retired, arrived to investigate, he found no signs of recent activity and concluded that the caller had probably mistaken sounds from a nearby farm or misidentified lights from passing traffic on the state highway. Detective Reeves located Murphy, now 71 and living in Florida, and interviewed him about that night. Murphy, despite his age, had maintained detailed personal records of his police career and was able to provide specific details about the call. He remembered being puzzled by the report because the caller, Mrs. Helen Dubois, was known for her reliability and rarely made frivolous complaints to police. However, when he investigated the scene, Murphy had found no evidence of vehicles or digging activity. Mrs. Dubois was adamant about what she'd seen and heard, Murphy recalled. She said there were definitely vehicle lights moving around the railroad yard, and she could hear what sounded like metal tools hitting the ground. But when I got there with my flashlight, everything was quiet and still. I walked around for about 20 minutes, checking the whole area, but didn't find anything disturbed. Murphy admitted that at the time, with the search for the missing children dominating police resources, the incident had been filed away and largely forgotten. Mrs. Dubois had died in 2003, taking her first-hand account of that evening to the grave. However, her daughter, Patricia, still lived in Millbrook and remembered her mother talking about the Halloween night incident for years afterward. Mom was convinced she'd seen something important that night, Patricia recalled. She always felt guilty that the police hadn't found anything when they investigated, like she'd somehow failed to help find those missing kids. She used to say that maybe if she'd called sooner or been more specific about what she saw, things might have been different. The railroad yard location was significant for several reasons. It was less than 2 miles from the abandoned theater, connected by old service roads that were rarely used by regular traffic. More importantly, the area included several abandoned rail cars and maintenance sheds that could have provided concealment for vehicles or other activity. Detective Reeves obtained permission to search the property, though she harbored little hope of finding evidence after nearly 4 decades. The search of the railroad yard was conducted over 3 days in late September 2023, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs borrowed from the state police. The technology revealed several areas of disturbed soil, but most were consistent with old railroad maintenance activities or natural settling. However, in a wooded area approximately 50 yards from the main rail line, the radar detected what appeared to be a deliberately excavated and filled area, roughly 6 feet by 10 feet and about 4 feet deep. The decision to excavate was not made lightly. Detective Reeves consulted with the state police, the county prosecutor, and the families of the missing children before proceeding. The dig began on October 1st, 2023, almost exactly 37 years after Rebecca, Tommy, and David had vanished. media attention was intense, with news crews maintaining a constant presence outside the search area perimeter. The excavation revealed a carefully constructed grave containing the remains of 3 children. The bodies had been wrapped in plastic sheeting and buried with what appeared to be deliberate care. They were positioned side by side, and personal items had been placed with each body. Rebecca Martinez was identified by dental records and a distinctive bracelet her grandmother had given her. Tommy Chen was recognized by a unique class ring he'd received early for academic achievement. And David Robertson was confirmed through dental records and a small scar on his leg from a bicycle accident the previous summer. The discovery brought closure to a mystery that had haunted Millbrook for nearly 4 decades, but it also raised new questions about who had been responsible for the children's deaths and burial. Forensic examination revealed that all 3 children had died from blunt force trauma to the head, suggesting they had been murdered rather than dying as the result of an accident or misadventure. The careful burial and the placement of personal items suggested that whoever had killed them had known them personally or had felt some remorse about their actions. Detective Reeves focused her investigation on individuals who would have had access to both the theater and the railroad yard, as well as those who might have had reason to be in both locations on Halloween night 1986. The list of potential suspects was surprisingly short, given Millbrook's small size and the specific circumstances of the case. However, one name began to emerge from witness interviews and historical research: Frank Kowalski, the former maintenance supervisor for the railroad company and the ex-husband of Emma Kowalski, the waitress who had seen lights in the theater that night. Frank Kowalski had died in 2019, taking any direct answers about his potential involvement to the grave. However, Detective Reeves's investigation revealed a troubling pattern of behavior and circumstantial evidence that pointed toward his involvement in the children's disappearance. Kowalski had been known to have a drinking problem and a volatile temper, particularly after his divorce from Emma in 1988. More significantly, he had unrestricted access to both the abandoned theater building, the railroad company had held a maintenance contract for the property, and the railroad yard where the children's bodies were eventually found. Emma Kowalski, now confronted with the possibility that her ex-husband might have been responsible for the disappearance of 3 children, initially refused to believe the accusations. However, as Detective Reeves presented evidence and encouraged her to remember details from that period of her life, troubling memories began to surface. Emma recalled that Frank had come home very late on Halloween night 1986, claiming he'd been called in for emergency railroad maintenance work. His clothes had been dirty, and he'd immediately thrown them in the wash and taken a long shower, saying he'd been working in muddy conditions. More significantly, Emma remembered that Frank's behavior had changed markedly in the weeks following Halloween 1986. He'd become increasingly paranoid and suspicious, frequently checking locks on their doors and windows, and becoming agitated whenever police cars passed their house. At the time, she'd attributed his anxiety to work stress and their deteriorating marriage, but in retrospect, his behavior seemed consistent with someone harboring a terrible secret. He started drinking more heavily after that Halloween, Emma recalled painfully, and he would have these nightmares where he'd wake up screaming. When I asked him about it, he'd just say he was having bad dreams about work accidents. I thought maybe he was worried about getting hurt on the job, but now I wonder if he was dreaming about something else entirely. Detective Reeves also discovered that Frank Kowalski had been one of the individuals responsible for securing the theater building in late 1986, part of an effort by the property owners to prevent further break-ins by teenagers. This would have given him legitimate reason to be at the theater on Halloween night, and might explain how he encountered the 3 missing children. A theory began to emerge that Rebecca, Tommy, and David might have seen Kowalski engaged in some kind of illegal activity, perhaps drug dealing or theft, and he had killed them to prevent them from reporting what they'd witnessed. The investigation into Frank Kowalski revealed additional troubling information about his background and behavior. Military records showed that he had served in Vietnam and had been treated for what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though such conditions were poorly understood and treated in the 1980s. Neighbors from the period remembered him as increasingly unstable and prone to violent outbursts, particularly when he'd been drinking. Several people recalled incidents where he had threatened local teenagers who he claimed were trespassing on railroad property or vandalizing buildings under his care. Dr. James Chen, despite his advanced age and the emotional toll of finally learning his son's fate, provided crucial information about Tommy's activities on Halloween Day 1986. He remembered that Tommy had been particularly excited about exploring the old theater, which he'd heard other kids talking about at school. Tommy had mentioned to his father that he and his friends were considering stopping by the theater after the parade to look for ghosts, typical childhood fascination with scary abandoned places on Halloween night. Tommy was always curious about everything, Dr. Chen explained through tears. He would have been drawn to that old building like a magnet, especially on Halloween. If he and his friends had wandered away from the parade route to investigate the theater, and if they'd encountered someone there who was up to no good. He couldn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. The final pieces of the puzzle came from forensic analysis of evidence found with the children's bodies. DNA testing of clothing fragments revealed the presence of foreign genetic material that didn't match any of the three victims. When compared against DNA samples obtained from Frank Kowalski's medical records, preserved from a hospital stay in 2017, the samples showed a strong probability of a match. While the degraded condition of the evidence made absolute confirmation impossible, the forensic specialists concluded that the DNA evidence was consistent with Kowalski having had direct contact with the children around the time of their deaths. Additional evidence included fibers found on the children's clothing that matched work uniforms worn by railroad maintenance personnel in the 1980s, as well as traces of industrial lubricants and solvents commonly used in railroad operations during that period. The careful burial of the bodies, combined with their placement in an area Kowalski would have known well from his work, further supported the theory of his involvement in their deaths. On November 15, 2023, Detective Reeves officially closed the case of the missing Millbrook children, concluding that Frank Kowalski had been responsible for their murders on Halloween night 1986. While Kowalski's death meant that he could never be prosecuted for his crimes, the evidence was sufficient to provide closure to the families and the community that had been haunted by the mystery for 37 years. The three children were finally laid to rest in a ceremony attended by hundreds of people from Millbrook and surrounding communities. Rebecca Martinez, Tommy Chen, and David Robertson were buried side by side in Millbrook Cemetery, their graves marked with headstones that celebrated their young lives and the friendship that had bound them together until the very end. The inscription, chosen jointly by their families, read simply, "Together always, three friends who will never be forgotten." For the families, the discovery brought a mixture of grief and relief. The decades of uncertainty were finally over, replaced by the painful but definitive knowledge of what had happened to their children. Maria Martinez, now 68, spoke at the funeral service about her daughter's vibrant personality and the joy she had brought to everyone who knew her. "Rebecca would have grown up to do wonderful things," she said. "She would have been a teacher or a doctor, or maybe an actress. She had such big dreams for such a little girl. At least now we know she's finally at peace." Dr. Chen, despite his advanced age and failing health, insisted on delivering his own tribute to his son. Tommy was going to be a scientist, he said, his voice shaking with emotion. He was fascinated by the stars, by how things worked, by the mysteries of the universe. He would have made discoveries that changed the world. Instead, he became part of a mystery that took us 37 years to solve. But at least now we have our answers and we can say goodbye properly. Robert Robertson, now struggling with dementia and confined to a wheelchair, was represented at the service by his daughter and grandchildren, David's nieces and nephews who had grown up hearing stories about the uncle they'd never met. David's sister spoke about the superhero costume her brother had worn on his last Halloween, noting that in his own way he had become a hero by helping to solve a mystery that had troubled their community for decades. The old Millbrook Theater was demolished in December 2023, its destruction marking the end of a chapter in the town's history that had brought so much pain and uncertainty. The site was eventually developed into a small memorial park dedicated to Rebecca, Tommy, and David, with playground equipment and benches where families could gather safely. A bronze plaque commemorated the three friends and their story, serving as both a memorial and a reminder of the importance of protecting children and seeking justice for victims of violence. The case had a lasting impact on Detective Reeves, who had devoted months of her career to finally solving the mystery. She reflected on the importance of never giving up on cold cases, noting that advances in technology and changes in community memory could sometimes provide new opportunities to find answers to old questions. "These three children deserved justice," she said in a final interview about the case. "It took us 37 years to give it to them, but they finally got it. Their families finally got the closure they needed, and our community could finally heal from this tragedy." The story of the Millbrook Halloween disappearance became a case study in criminal justice programs and a reminder that even the coldest cases might eventually be solved through persistence, technological advances, and the willingness of communities to confront difficult truths about their past. For the small town of Millbrook, the resolution brought an end to decades of speculation and fear, allowing residents to remember Rebecca Martinez, Tommy Chen, and David Robertson not as victims of an unsolved mystery, but as three young friends whose lives, though tragically cut short, had left a lasting impact on everyone who knew their story.